we're not just an idea. This is a real nation with real people. And we've got to be centered, I think, our party and fighting for them. And if we do that, we're going to continue to win elections. If we don't do that and we seep back into this idea that we can be everywhere all at once across the world, that we can be the global cop on the beat, people, real people, reject that. And so when Joe Biden's letting 15 million people here illegally, people don't understand, how could the president of our country allow this? And the answer is he bought into and was captured by this worldview that there wasn't anything particularly unique, that America was just some economic zone with an airport attached to it.
Thank you so much for tuning into the Signal Sitdown, but before we get to the interview, we'd love it if you'd hit that like and subscribe button on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you may be joining us. And please remember to give us a 5-star review because we love your feedback. Remember, it's your government, and together we'll expose how it really works and how to affect real change. Without further ado, here's the interview. Senator Eric Schmitt, welcome to the Signal Sitdown.
It's great to be here.
I'm very excited to have you here today because an hour ago, the House passed this budget reconciliation package. Now it's going to be in your guys' hands in the Senate, and we're going to release this episode over the Memorial Day break. So who knows exactly what's going to take shape until then, but we're definitely going to get into it. And I think it's interesting that the issues that this is always a fight over the mantle of Trumpism now, when you're talking about folks in the SALT caucus, even the moderates in the blue states, talking about how the president doesn't want to touch Medicaid. Don't touch Medicaid. We are the Trumpers. And then there's the House Freedom Caucus. Hey, president promised to balance the budget, cut spending, massive reform, immigration. We're the Trumpers. It is a fight over the commanding heights of the issues that animated that campaign: trade, foreign policy, and immigration. You have been on the president's side of these issues far longer than most people in Washington, D.C., all the way back from your early days.
Yeah, no, I think I was the second senator to endorse him, maybe the first, but very, very early on, and got to know him when I was Attorney General in Missouri. My term overlapped with his first term for a couple of years, and then it just sort of developed a relationship. I get to play golf with the president and went to the Super Bowl on Air Force One. So all things are kind of fun. But at the end of the day, it's really about delivering. And I think growing up where I grew up, this is the party that I always hoped for. I grew up in a working class neighborhood in the St. Louis area. My dad worked 7 days a week in the midnight shift. And so I would, my friends and neighbors, most of them were Democrats. Now, they're not Democrats anymore. And many of those folks are people that Trump kind of courted over to the Republican cause with this new era of our party. And so I joked when I was at the convention, I had a chance to speak, that we had Hulk Hogan, Kid Rock, and like normal people speaking on the podium. This is the party I've been waiting for my whole life. So it's very comfortable for me. And I love it because what we've done is we've broadened this base now. And that's what President Trump has done. He's ushered in this new era where there's more people. And I think the cabinet, and I was very out front early advocating for the cabinet members when some people were, saying some other things. Because first of all, he deserves.
We need to wait for CBS News to come out with another report on this issue.
Right? Yeah, give me a break. Like that era's over. It's just go. It's time to go, and it's reflective, I think, of the diverse coalition that now is a part of the party. I mean, RFK Jr. Right, kind of the Maha movement that brought in an entirely new segment of voters who viewed the Democrats as really the establishment. And you look at COVID in particular. You saw just the excesses of government and the whole trust the science crowd who had their Fauci candles. It was really bizarre. And for me, COVID was really kind of this revealing time. And I think a lot of people, masks were off,
Masks were on, but they came off.
Right? And
masks off of the elite.
And for me, it was really an interesting time because I was Attorney General. We brought the vaccine mandate case to the Supreme Court. We won. I sued like 65 school districts in Missouri for forced masking. We sued cities who had mask mandates. We had the student loan debt forgiveness case that Biden had. We had the free speech Missouri versus Biden lawsuit. So for me, those Biden years, those were the COVID times, the dark times, right? And now we're here. President Trump executed the greatest political comeback in American history. And so I think this one big, beautiful bill is an opportunity to deliver on a lot of those promises. So yeah, a lot of people are kind of grabbing onto bits and pieces, and that's okay, because I think now we're a broader based party. The challenge we have is they're more lower propensity voters typically, and so like at midterms or when Trump's not on the ballot, that's our challenge. But I'd much rather be us right now than the Democrats.
Yeah, you mentioned RFK bringing in a whole different suite of voters, low propensity voters, multi-ethnic working class stuff that, the new right has been talking about for, really the last decade before Trump came about. But when Trump came on the scene, it actually seemed like it became a possibility, and it's manifested. The Republicans, through proper grassroots strategy, through a great message from the President of the United States, has made good on that promise. But one question that continues to befuddle people in Washington is, what is a conservative anymore? There's so many legs to this stool. So I guess explain to our viewers how you see the current American right. Is conservative a useful term to describe it, or is it a coalition that's united by something else? And where are the different factions?
Yeah, I think the new right is maybe the ascending term, I suppose. But I think that it's been for what President Trump has been able to deliver. It's a 10-year journey now, right? So it's a rather mature effort. And you look and see what's happening now in Congress. You've got now more than his first term in 2017. You have people like myself or others. JD, of course, a very good friend of mine, is now the vice president, but people who kind of came in to the Senate or into Congress in the Trump era. So it's very different, and I think it's a good thing. And this is a movement that isn't going away. This is the future, in my view. And you could probably go back to Pat Buchanan as sort of the harbinger in many ways.
Yeah, he was the canary in the coal mine.
Really was. And in a very important historical time. So here's how I see it. You kind of had, after World War II, we had a trade policy and a foreign policy that was centered on, we were the conquerors, we were the victors. And all of those efforts were meant to sort of rebuild our European allies in Japan, to bring them into the fold and defeat Soviet communism. That defined our foreign policy in the sense that we had this security umbrella for our friends and allies. We had trade deals that weren't really good for us, but that allowed them to get back on their feet. And then the Cold War ends. And to me, this is the squandering really of the inheritance. This is when the mistakes were made, because the people in charge, the elites, they never really adjusted. They never adjusted trade policy. They never really adjusted foreign policy. You sort of had this globalist view of the kind of the end of history. They didn't really view many of them as sort of Americans, but sort of global citizens. And that fueled kind of this mass migration. It fueled a wandering, aimless, Wilsonian kind of foreign policy that was based on these abstract ideas of global democracy. And were never really rooted then in what are the core interests of the United States of America, our country. And I think you've now seen a resurgence. So on the foreign policy front, you see a resurgence of American realism, which, by the way, had been the foreign policy of the country for a very, very long time. You sort of had, again, this era after World War II until the Cold War ended, where we had a Soviet communism to beat. But I think we're getting back to that. You've seen President Trump with the guts now to stand up for working people. And that's really, if you had to identify what the party really stands for now, I think it's a party of the working class, who sees the institutions that the left has sort of co-opted as aimed against them. And it's a disruptive mentality. And that's a good thing, because permanent Washington is a real thing. And it's very difficult to beat. But President Trump has been fearless in this. And you've got a whole cast of characters now that want to take on those tough fights. And that's what the 2024 election was all about. It was the disruptors versus the establishment. And so, there's certainly Republicans were a part of this problem too, I think, in the post-Cold War era, with trade policies that they defended that shipped our jobs overseas. We've seen devastation in our communities, factories that are desolate now, and they've been replaced with, in many ways, despair and death. Fentanyl replacing good-paying jobs. And so in my state, Missouri was hit hard. I gave a floor speech a few weeks ago and talked about this. So I think it's important, before we talk about the future and where this goes, is we had to talk about the past. and there has to be a reckoning with what went wrong. And so President Trump hitting the reset button, I think, on trade is very important. And what do you see now? Countries acknowledging, yes, this was a little bit unfair to the United States, and we're going to come to the table, and we're going to have much more fair trade, and those trade barriers are going to come down. This is going to be a good thing for us. You've seen record investment now, $10 trillion in investment in manufacturing, Apple, Mercedes-Benz, NVIDIA, all these companies now, they want to build things in the United States of America. And I think reestablishing this national pride. And so I think what also happened of this lack of loyalty to the United States and the sort of globalist worldview, you saw then the infusion of kind of cultural Marxism. Think of DEI, think of critical race theory, that America was nothing really special. Barack Obama said this. He said, do you believe in American exceptionalism? He said, well, I think one of the worst things he ever said, he said, well, sure, as much as an Irish guy might think of Irish exceptionalism, that misses the entirety of the point of what a unique experiment this is in the course of human history. And it's something that we got to fight for. And so we got to push back these efforts to sort of undermine our culture. We're not just an idea. This is a real nation with real people. And we've got to be centered, I think, our party and fighting for them. And if we do that, we're going to continue to win elections. If we don't do that and we seep back into this idea that we can be everywhere all at once across the world, that we can be the global cop on the beat, real people reject that. They don't see that as relevant in their lives. What are our core interests? How do we get a better trade deal? How are we energy dominant? How can we go do that? Everybody understands what that means. And then this sort of beating back the administrative state and all the things that permanent Washington does to interfere, not just in enterprise, but in people's lives, taking away their livelihoods. So these are the fights. And that's why I'm excited to be here in this time, because like I said, historically, we've got World War II to Cold War. Then you have the squandering of the inheritance. And now President Trump broke through. What do we do next? What is the next chapter? And I think that's what's exciting about what's happening right now in the country.
Yeah, with a voting bloc that I don't think anyone, even those of us on the new right who put some rosy predictions out there of what the new coalition might look like 5-10 years down the road, I don't think we thought it would be this broad, and I don't think we thought it would come this soon, which all means that Republicans, at least Donald Trump at the top, and Republicans by following his example, are tapping into those kind of mass sentiments, those populist sentiments. You said something really interesting in that response, though, which was it's almost a chicken or the egg problem when we look at the elites who've squandered this inheritance, where they elevated everything to abstractions, whether that's America as a creedal nation, or they, abstracted Reagan himself, Reaganism.
Right.
Of course, Reaganism just stands for whatever slogan that think tank is pushing that day, or even free market fundamentalism, economics. Everything was brought to the level of abstraction. And the result of that was, well, then it doesn't actually matter what the makeup of the country is. Mass migration follows. Or was the incentive for there to be mass migration first, and all of these arguments that bring things to the level of abstraction, is that just a way for them to cover their tails and cover their tracks? Which one do you think it is?
Well, I think what happened, and it's sort of a double whammy for the people that I grew up with. The jobs are shipped overseas for cheaper labor, slave labor, and nobody really wanted to talk about that. There was certainly a motive behind that. And then the people who were left behind in many ways were replaced with cheap, illegal, or mass migration here.
Right.
So you think
we sent the jobs abroad because it was cheaper there. Then we wanted to, quote unquote, compete with this slave labor, so we imported our own to the country.
Correct. And this is one of the great sins. And people are smart. And when you're in a state like Missouri, and I ran statewide 3 times in 6 years, you get around and you talk to people. And Missouri was for a long time very much a bellwether state. You've got urban, suburban, exurban, rural. You got Southeast Missouri is much more like the South, and Northwest Missouri is much more like Nebraska. It's a sort of the cultural crossroads of the country. And when you get around and you talk to people, that's what they couldn't believe what was happening. And so when Joe Biden's letting 15 million people here illegally, people don't understand, how could the president of our country allow this? And the answer is that he bought into and was captured by this worldview that there wasn't anything particularly unique, that America was just some economic zone with an airport attached to it. And what we're saying is, no, America's much more than that. It's our home. We're a people, and we believe in things, and that we ought to be fighting for the dignity of the guy that doesn't have the PhD, but who wants to work, and he wants to be able to raise a family, and he wants his kids to have a better life. He shouldn't have to compete with foreign labor for that. He shouldn't, and we shouldn't be encouraging. We shouldn't be importing that. And that's what the idea was. So you had this mass migration, and I think one of the really interesting things then is, you had what's been exposed with Doge, and there's a reason why they started with USAID. The corruptness of that. So that's on full display. Think about the people who are handing out this money. No real loyalty, in my view, to the United States of America. It's just sort of this globalist mentality. And so they're using your tax dollars to fund NGOs to fuel mass migration into the country. They use it to censor Americans who disagree with them. This was all being done with our own money. And that was all exposed. And that's the kind of stuff that needs to go away. But that's just kind of a glimpse into how they view this whole thing. And again, COVID, power doesn't necessarily corrupt, but it does reveal. Mm-hmm. And I think that was a moment in time where we saw what the motives really were. And it was to set the narrative. Anybody who disagreed was an extremist, a Nazi, a radical, whatever term that they want to use, which has now completely jumped the shark, to demonize and then silence. And they were willing to use the government and create a disinformation governance board to work with some of the biggest companies in the history of the world, big tech, who was, by the way, all on board with all of this stuff, to silence regular Americans who happen to raise questions about, well, what about the efficacy of masks? Sorry, can't talk about that. Does the vaccine actually prevent transmission? Sorry, you're silenced for that. Didn't this start in a Wuhan lab? You're a racist. Shut up. Like, think of it. So, yeah. So I think actually part of this coalition too that doesn't get talked about enough is younger people. So typically, as we all sort of follow this, people get more conservative as they get older. You have a whole new generation now that is overwhelmingly more Republican than they are Democrat, more conservative than they are liberal. And part of that, I think, is they saw what happened during COVID when they were, you couldn't go on campus without getting the shot, or you couldn't attend your graduation without a mask on. And they rejected that. And so as long as I think we're raging against that machine on behalf of the people who just don't trust these institutions that have lied to them over and over again, we're going to be successful, and then be the Reform Party. And again, I think that's what's kind of exciting about what's going on.
There's an interesting dynamic. You've mentioned it a few times. Hulk Hogan and normal people. Yeah. Out there on the RNC stage, the disruptors versus the establishment.
Because that's what, by the way, that's what real people do. Like they'll like the personality of Hulk Hogan. And what's a glimpse of
this cuts to like the GOP has positioned itself, or the right broadly has positioned itself as a countercultural movement.
Yes.
And at the same time, the party of normal people.
Yeah.
And how do you square that circle? The only way that I've kind of figured out how to square it is there needs to be a machine that is, the establishment is focused on making you freak. It wants you to be fat and lazy and stupid, and it wants you to live off the government dole. It doesn't want you to be spirited. It doesn't want you to be faithful. It doesn't want you to be dynamic in any way, shape, or form in your life. And that's the only way that I've figured out how to square that circle, being both the party of punk rock and the party of normal. What do you, I mean, do you think that's right?
The establishment has lined up, and there are some Republicans part of this, have lined up they're okay with deciding what's disinformation and misinformation or malinformation. They're okay with that. They're okay with mass migration for some of the reasons we talked about. They're okay with a foreign policy that allows them to go on these foreign trips and have everybody roll out the red carpet and pat them on the back, and they tell them how great they are because they're there and they're we're spreading ourselves way too thin for what our real threat is, which is China. And I also think a piece of this too is this sort of Marxist ideology that's infused itself, particularly in the Democrat Party now, where when you had President Otto Penn in office, you had all these people who were, gender study majors at Ivy League institutions who think they're really smart, who used to write white papers about open borders, were somehow in charge of our border. Mm-hmm. And they saw nothing wrong with having an open border. And that's not the Democrat Party of 30 years ago even, right? When this sort of movement kind of began, they believed in the sovereignty of a country. They don't really believe that anymore. And so that's part of it. And then also they viewed, I think, as becoming a permanent majority, affecting the census, affecting the congressional districts, affecting the electoral college. And then ultimately you make the problem big enough, the only solution is for mass migration is mass amnesty.
Yeah, you'll notice that they were the ones who started peddling the Great Replacement theory. Great Replacement theory.
Yeah.
First. And then the right had the gall to notice, and also notice how unpopular it was with the people. And then we were all labeled as racist and bigots for just pointing to op-eds in the Washington Post and the New York Times. You guys are saying it out loud right here in print. The entire world can read this piece right now. They don't write those pieces anymore. They don't talk about how the right are great replacement theorists or how they plan about replacing the demographics of the country, at least out loud in public. But they've rigged the rules of the game while the right were sleeping with the power that we afforded them because we were too afraid to use power properly. As you said, power doesn't necessarily corrupt, but it certainly reveals. We were asleep at the wheel, and they rigged the game so that now if an illegal migrant came in the first day of the Biden administration in that massive caravan, he's been here for more than 2 years, and Trump is kind of stuck with him if something doesn't change.
Well, right. And so we've got legislation on that. I've introduced with Ashley Moody, who also was an attorney general in Florida. We served together. She's been a great addition to basically the expedited removal. If you've been here for less than 2 years, you don't have to have the same court hearings and those sort of things that you basically, an immigration official says you're out of here, and it's expedited and it's removal and you're gone. And so we need to expand that, not just the 2-year window, but if you're here, if you're if you're a felon, if you're part of a criminal organization, a designated terrorist organization, we can expedite that process. And so the mass migration needs to be met with mass deportation. And so those are, I think, some of the efforts that we need to push forward. I do think President Trump, by and large, though, is going to be successful in court as these things make their way through. It's kind of difficult when you get one district court opinion here. It's like judging a baseball game. It's a 9-inning game with every pitch. You can get caught up too much in that. But there are obviously a lot of abuses that are happening right now. You see that with some of the sheer number of nationwide injunctions from district court judges. So, but look, I think the left understands they were playing a game of getting a permanent majority and total control, because it's important, I think, to remember how close we were to maybe losing all of this, because if they had the House and they had the Senate and Biden or Harris or somebody else was in the White House, they would eliminate the
Whoever
filibuster.
had the auto pen.
Yeah. They would eliminate the filibuster in the Senate. They'd add states to the Union. They would pack the United States Supreme Court. They would get mass amnesty. They'd add a bunch of new voters. And they viewed, and they very well could have been in the majority for a very, very long time. And then at that point, all the things that we're talking about right now are just, again, people are writing about them, not actually implementing them. And so Trump is a unique political figure in that way. He was able to break through. And that's why they came at him so hard. That's why the lawfare was so instructive of what they're, and even now, think about it. You've got a United States senator who could care less or couldn't care less about citizens of his state being murdered. There's no calls to those folks, but was willing to go down to El Salvador to have, margaritas with an MS-13 member. It is a glimpse of how broken the Democrat Party is. And it's because of Barack Obama ushered this obsession with identity politics. It's an obsession. And where you fit on that totem pole, it means everything. And when we talk about critical race theory, we talk about DEI, really what that ideology, it's based on cultural Marxism. You divide the room by oppressor and oppressed. That's it. And that it's this race essentialism that is poison. And it was in our military and is in the corporate boardrooms. And you're seeing a retreat from that because it's inherently racial discrimination. And I think you're going to see the Justice Department take on more of these cases. The DEI is nothing more than discriminatory hiring practices or promoting practices based on race. That's illegal in this country.
Yeah.
And
right? In case you didn't know.
Right, that's illegal. But the Justice Department under Joe Biden didn't want to do anything about that. They wanted to go after Catholics, and they wanted to go up to parents who show up to school board meetings and try to intimidate them as domestic terrorists under the Patriot Act. This is all in the United States of America, all the while censoring Americans who disagreed with them. So this is a very Orwellian world we lived through for 4 years. And I think we've got an opportunity to break through that, to sort of break the wheel.
Yeah, they keep calling these people this, El Salvadorian man, which everyone's calling him
Maryland man.
Maryland man. I know it's supposed to be ironic, but we shouldn't label them that.
They aren't doing that as much anymore.
They aren't.
And they'll move. And the other thing that's a tell is they move from issue to issue every day, trying to find something. It's swinging at every pitch. It's the plane. It's the Maryland man. It's the threat to democracy. Now it's a constitutional crisis. They are grasping at straws, and they're losing because they played that card for so long. And the American people, I think, sat in that jury box over the last few years, and they weighed all the evidence, and they said, "We think you're full of shit, and we're going to send President Trump back into office."
Absolutely.
And they still have not come to grips with that.
Yeah, but it's like they keep calling these people their constituents. It's like what the hell is that?
Yeah. It is. It's a brokenness of the mind. It is this idea. It is a confused compassion. As a former prosecutor, my compassion lies with the victims, their families, who've been terrorized by criminals. And so my job was to put the bad guys in jail. My compassion is for, like I said, the victims. This misplaced view of that criminal is somehow a victim of something else has just become a big part of this whole kind of ideology. And they can't break from that yet. And I don't think the Democrats have hit rock bottom. They haven't. And they're going to have you got all these people jockeying to be the biggest resistor, who's going to take on, Trump, and then who's going to run for president in 2028. They're still grappling with all the underlying problems that they have, with this obsession with, identity politics and this wokeness that, as much as some consultant might go on Fox every once in a while and say this is a real problem for us, when they start campaigning, they're going to continue to court the radical left to win the nomination. And I think, again, with this coalition that we have, as long as we do our jobs and continue to speak up for working people, to fight for the truck driver and the waitress who doesn't want their tax dollars to go pay off the student loan of a college theater professor who just decided to stop paying, or, if that's who we're fighting for, we're going to win. But we can't fall back into this mindset that, this foreign policy that was aimless, or a trade policy that was really not in the interests of the United States. We can't fall back into that. So the real test will be, as President Trump, I think, kind of leads this new era, how do we carry forward that mission? And I think a very successful, not just a political ideology, but really a movement that represents the hopes and dreams of normal people.
Yeah, I think one of the dirty little secrets on the right is that everyone anticipated, because we were asleep for so long, that when we decided that we got comfortable using government power again, that the ratchets were going to come down. Now, we could have sat here in 2019 and said, okay, if Trump loses in 2020, they're going to try to do everything that they can to stop him from coming back into office. I don't know if we anticipated that it would be so broad-based, but the reason that Republicans were so excised wasn't because they're surprised, it was because the injustice of the thing. You don't have to be surprised to be outraged.
But think about that. So President Trump is like sort of the Uber example. But anybody, I was
disinformation boards. You mentioned targeting Catholics. I mean, you're a Catholic.
Yeah.
Tell us about those things.
Yeah, it is a way to the othering of half of America, to create them as sort of the real enemies of the country. And so let's just take President Trump aside for 1 second. You saw anybody who raised questions about how some of the states were changing the rules of the game because of COVID before the 2020 election as some election denier that should be cast out. You saw anybody that questioned forced masking or the COVID shot or any, just pick whatever the left's thing was, or why are we spending 120, almost $200 billion in Ukraine when we have crumbling roads and bridges in our country? If you raise that, again, it was all this effort to sort of other and cast out anybody that disagreed with the broader globalist kind of establishment. And President Trump broke the wheel. I'd like to say the fever broke.
Yeah.
He broke the fever in 2024. And so it's a huge opportunity for us. But I think they felt like they were on the cusp of, after President Trump was gone, that they were going to make MAGA or anybody that was America first so disgusting to a normal person that they would never get back in power again. What I don't think they fully appreciated was that actually that's kind of where the American people are at. And they saw the abuses of power and they pushed back against that. Yeah. You know, the legal system isn't supposed to be weaponized against your political enemies. To throw a presidential candidate in jail for the rest of his life, to bankrupt his family. That is what happens in banana republics. And our State Department would warn Americans about traveling to that country if that's kind of the way it was. You wouldn't have a business set up shop in a country where the laws are weaponized because of your political ideology. And so, but that's the world that they were creating here in this country. And again, you could go back to, I think, this sort of what they proclaimed to be the end of history after the Cold War. We're all global citizens. America doesn't mean a whole lot. It's just an economic zone. We can have our jobs shipped overseas, all those good paying jobs, and we get cheap Chinese t-shirts in return, and everything's going to be great. Well, it turns out that work is important for people. It gives them meaning. And I think if we're honoring the dignity of every individual, which we should, that's a big part of what we should be fighting for. And President Trump tapped into that in a way that no political figure in my lifetime has ever really tapped into, because that is, he met the American people really where they were. And we mentioned Pat Buchanan. Pat Buchanan was sort of raising these alarm bells 30 years ago. But it just,
but he was
the outlier.
He was the outlier. And now
the harbinger.
The fever broke analogy is I think a really apt one, because you saw it with Marco Rubio testifying in the Senate, going after Senator Van Hollen. Well, if you regret my vote for me, it means I'm doing a pretty darn good job, in my opinion.
And it's an insight into Republicans. When they fight back, we can win.
Right. The fever broke, and Senator, or now Secretary Rubio, friend of you, friend of me, he has not changed his thinking too much on the foreign policy front, but over the course of the Trump movement, I think, he was more hawkish on the Middle East, maybe you could say, et cetera, but the Trump movement has kind of changed his mind on those sorts of things. On the other hand, he's always been very focused on China, very concerned about a rising China. And I think the fever broke, and he's able to, with the cover of President Trump, go in and speak so directly to Democrats, the establishment, the elite class, about how bad they screwed this whole thing up. Whereas sans Trump, a world without Trump, I don't think Rubio goes in and is that direct and aggressive about these things, saying, no, we are going to reestablish the rules of the game, which is what was required it's required with immigration, as we talked about. It's required with trade, as we talked about. But it's also required with foreign policy, because you can't have those two other buckets full if you don't address the foreign policy problem.
Well, and a good example of that is sort of my first 2 years in the Senate and now. When we were having this, there was this obsession with pumping more money to Ukraine. And the truth is, and we should talk about this because it kind of goes to this deindustrialization and the fact that our industrial base is atrophied. Europe's is worse. But talking about sending more money, there were a few of us who were speaking on the Senate floor, Marco Rubio, J.D. Vance, myself, some others, who were sort of lamenting this kind of, I think, failed foreign policy view. And I think our view is ascending with President Trump in office. It's certainly the ascending view. And it's based in sort of American realism, what do you want to call it, prioritizers, or sort of this Jacksonian worldview where our core interest, the United States of America, reigns supreme. Our chief rival China, that is the most important thing we could be focused on other than protecting the homeland. And Europe needs to step up in a much more meaningful way for their own defense. Again, we're not abandoning allies, but this idea that we're still providing the same sort of we're going to do everything and pay for everything like we did in 1965 is an outdated model, and it doesn't serve our interests as the United States of America. When you've got China building islands in the South China Sea, they're in space for real. They got a bigger Navy, not a better Navy than we have right now. Like, they're real. They're coming. They want to eat our lunch. And you still have people very sort of Euro focused on that, and we have to be much more oriented towards the Indo-Pacific. But yeah, Marco Rubio's been a great spokesman for that. He's speaking clearly. President Trump has been very clear about what our interests are. You look at this Middle East trip, I think he gave, it's very underrated because people were focused on other things to try to undermine him, but very successful, trillions of dollars worth of investment. But also, when he's in Saudi Arabia, he basically says, the days of us looking into the souls of foreign leaders and deciding if we think you're a good person or a bad person, and based on that judgment, we're going to bomb the hell out of your country, then engage in nation building, those days are over.
That was probably the best speech that I'd heard from President Trump since his, I believe, speech in Warsaw.
Yeah, it's very good. And it laid it out in real terms. And when you have that kind of leadership, more people will come around, because that is a point of view that is much more aligned with where real Americans are at. Not the DC think tanks, and not all the people who didn't want Pete Hegseth to be the defense secretary, and not all the people that didn't like Bridge Colby to be the policy director. Like, this is, so you think about all these pieces that are coming in place. This is the ascending view. And I think for good reason, it places our interests above everyone else's, and it should. We're a country. We're our own. Like, we are here for Americans first. And then we do have interests in other parts of the world. This isn't isolationism, as some people would like to cast it. It is realism. And we're going to be realistic about the world that we live in, and we're going to adjust to that while we rebuild our industrial base, while we can be more nimble, while we're more innovative. And Europe needs to get on board too. But look, they've let their defense industrial base atrophy. Even Germany, which was the one country that could probably produce things, they've gone through this deindustrialization. This globalist movement has hit Europe. They don't believe in free speech anymore. They're willing to throw people in jail. I was actually in Munich this spring to sort of deliver that message to our European friends, not just to tell them what they want to hear, but the truth, because not many senators go over there to do that. J.D. Vance did that, and I was probably one of 3 people clapping when he gave his speech. I stood up and clapped because he said, look, you want to lecture us about democracy and how we need to be spending more of our tax dollars over here on democracy. Where are you on the core tenets of democracy, like the ability to speak your mind, and the government isn't the arbiter of truth?
Yeah.
Where are you on that? So I thought that was a very good speech too.
It's very interesting because the neocons point to that speech and they'll go, see, values-based foreign policy, told you it's unavoidable, et cetera, et cetera. Well, of course, our view is just like Washington's view, interest guided by justice, for sure. Justice means that you have a number of duties, but the foremost duty is the people of your nation.
Right.
And you talk to these European countries, you go to these embassies and stuff, they kind of try to wine and dine you, especially as a journalist. But they go there and, they like say, well, America is a very big country and we just can't do anything about it. And then you push them on something and you say, well, if you take the European Union in total, we have more population and we have just as big of an economy, So actually, when you think about it, we're on a level playing field as you guys. And you say, okay, well then pay for your own defense. Right. What's the problem? And so that's why I think JD is so good at talking about the value stuff, because it means that Europe is going to step up not only in the defense front, but we need others to believe in the values that the American project is based upon in order to really pull this thing off.
And if you believe in Western civilization, which, by the way, the left has tried to turn that into a dirty word or a 4-letter word. Like, if you believe in Western civilization, some of those values, it's important for Europe to actually stand up for these kinds of values. But the truth is, if they spent what we spent as a percentage of GDP on their national defense, it would free up about $300 billion a year for us to do a lot of other things that we should be doing to protect our homeland, the Golden Dome, or making sure that we have the capability to fight China in the vast expanse of the Pacific. Because when you have a constrained or limited defense industrial base, and you are building tanks for a land war in Europe, you are necessarily not building long-range fires for the Indo-Pacific. And the people who tell you that we can do all of those things at the same time, they are lying to you. They want that to be true. It's not the truth. It's not real. And so this idea of American realism is to say, we're going to infuse reality into our foreign policy. And there's a lot of bad people in the world, and we can't rebuild every country in our own image. We want them to do all the things that we believe in, but we can't have our Marines sitting in every continent doing all of this stuff and expect us to be really prepared to fight for our own survival if that day were to ever come.
Probably the most difficult question, our last question, 30 seconds, big, beautiful bill. It's in your guys' hand now.
Yeah.
Where does it go?
I think we'll get it done. I think it may not look exactly like it looks right now, but I think everybody's very focused on delivering on President Trump's pledge and promise to the American people. I spent a lot of time with him on Trump Force One, or we're going around the country warming up crowds for the big act. And he talked about all the things that are there. And so we want to deliver on that. I think we want to set our country on a path to prosperity in this golden age for America that I really do think is within our reach. So there's a sense of urgency with what we have right now with the House and the Senate and the White House. So I think ultimately we'll be successful, and it'll be a lot of work in the next couple months to get that done.
We got so stuck on foreign policy and the right writ large that I needed to deliver on the promise that I made to the viewers.
The news of the day.
We talk a little bit about it.
Yeah.
Senator Eric Schmitt, thank you for coming on the Signal Sitdown.
It's great to be with you.
Thank you so much for tuning into the Signal Sitdown. Before you go, be sure to hit like and subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you may be joining us. And please remember to give us a 5-star review. We not only love your feedback, but it really does help the show. Remember, it's your government, and together we'll expose how it really works. See you next time.